So for those of you who are worshiping up with us for the first time this month, in the month of September, we are starting a sermon series, or continuing a sermon series rather, called Fear God, but it's actually a question. Because many of us grew up with a kind of understanding about God's nature that was one to be feared. And when I say feared, I mean like to be scared of, to be frightened of, to be almost in some ways very fearful of. And when we read the words fear God in the Bible, and it appears nearly 20 different times written out that way, it usually means to be reverent or to be in awe of God, to have great respect for God's power and majesty. And so fear is used probably in a different way biblically than we would talk about it in our time. But I want you to be thinking about God's true nature and the real way that God chooses to relate to humanity in terms of the stories that you're going to hear today. So I'm going to be reading to you from the Gospel according to Luke. I'll be reading what will probably be a very familiar story to you from a parable in the 15th chapter of Luke. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided the property between them. A few days later, the son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his field to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will go up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and he went with his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and he put his arms around him and he kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring a robe, the best one, and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son, the elder son, was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called to one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never given me even one young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So a couple weeks ago, I was out running an errand and I needed to buy a pair of pants. What I was not prepared for was that, having not bought a pair of pants since the pandemic started, that many stores currently have a policy where you can't use the fitting rooms. So I had to go in, pick what I thought was my size, and then I took it up to the register, and as I was paying for it, it occurred to ask the clerk, "So tell me about your return policy." And he said, "Oh, you can bring it back if it doesn't fit. Don't worry, we realize that these are, unusual circumstances." He said, "Most people are actually just buying it, going into the parking lot, and going into the back seat of their car and trying them on, and then returning them if they don't fit." Thinking that that was not how I wanted my day to go, nor did I want a misdemeanor from a passing officer, I decided that I was just going to buy them, take them home, try them on in the privacy of my own home, and decide whether or not I was going to keep them at that point. But it made me think about return policies and how probably all of that is changing and evolving as these businesses have to adapt to the pandemic. And I've also realized that a number of the clothes that I've bought, particularly sportswear or outdoor clothing, oftentimes come with a nice warranty. After all, the company wants you to be confident in your purchase. They want you to be happy long term with the choice that you have made. And so the warranty usually says, we will cover this against typical wear and tear, right? Or under normal circumstances. When used under normal circumstances, if there's a problem with this garment, we will replace it for you. And so, I was thinking about these different policies, and it turns out that there are some companies that people are very loyal to because they have very generous return policies. And some of you probably shop some places and not others because of their return policies or positive or negative experiences that you have had. Now, the company that, if you look online about this, that has the best reputation for a return policy is Nordstrom. Now, I have not done a significant amount of shopping at Nordstrom in my life, but apparently they're the store that everybody says has the best return policy, very generous in what they will take back. In fact, there is an urban legend that in the 1970s, a man used 4 tires on his car and then took them back and returned them at Nordstrom. The funny thing is Nordstrom has never sold tires or automotive parts in the history of their company. And so they actually found a reporter that went back and traced the origins of this story, and they confirmed it with a member of the Nordstrom family in 2015, that back in the 1970s, there was a man at one of their stores in Alaska who returned tires, and the clerk said, sure, we'll take them back, thus establishing that tradition as the best customer service and the best return policy of any store. But I got to thinking about these return policies as I was buying these pants, and it turns out I kept them, and no, these are not it. But I was thinking about how returns work. And I was thinking about normal wear and tear and under normal circumstances, and how returns can be different depending on what we're using them for. And I got to thinking about what it means to actually return to God when we have had some distance or separation. Now, I actually think that you can put these under 2 different kinds of categories. The times that we become distanced from God under normal wear and tear and under typical circumstances, and then there's the other kind as well. And I want to talk about those a little bit with you this morning. See, the first kind, the kind that I would probably classify under the normal circumstances, the normal wear and tear, is the kind of distance or separation that happens between us and God that, well, happens under normal circumstances. You know, I don't know if this rings true for you, but certainly it has been the case for me that without trying, there have been times that I have felt more distanced from God. And it's not like there was some major event in my life. It's not that there was some necessarily a great tragedy or anything like that, but it just sort of gradually happened. I mean, maybe it started off simple enough, like maybe it was a very busy Christmas season, and I had been in church so much, and I had been Christmas carols and Christmas festivities and all the things to get all the ducks in a row for the end of the year and all those final meetings and budgets and so forth, and it just felt like I just needed a little space. Maybe this was for my own mental well-being, but I just wanted a little bit of space. And what started off as a week of having a little bit of downtime after the week of Christmas turned into maybe my prayer life wasn't as active as it was leading up to that time. Or maybe my daily Bible reading started to get to be more like every 2 or 3 or 4 days between readings. And gradually, as it happened, you get into January and mid-January, and all of a sudden it dawned on me that there had been this distance between God and I, and my faith was not where I wanted it to be. And maybe that is something that sounds familiar to you, that those kinds of things that just sort of happen, again, under the normal wear and tear. So how do we return to God during a situation like that? Well, it's almost like Jesus anticipated that being a regular occurrence in our lives, because 2 parables before the prodigal son parable that I just read is the parable of the lost sheep. And if you remember how that parable goes, Jesus talks about the shepherd who, seeing one sheep that has gone missing, leaves the 99 in the flock and goes looking for the one. Now, on the one hand, it just doesn't sound like very good utilitarian thinking. Why would you abandon 99? I mean, after all, that's still 99% of the flock that you would leave to go after the one. But the shepherd is thinking, if I don't go after the one, what happens the time that the second one goes missing, or a third, or a fourth? And if you never go and track down a sheep when they are missing from the flock, eventually the flock will slowly be diminished. And so you have to leave the 99 to go after the one. And Jesus says, the good shepherd goes after the one, brings them back, and there is great rejoicing once the flock is made whole again. And so, as I say, it's almost as if Jesus anticipates that there will be some of these times that we will slowly find ourselves adrift from him and the rest of the flock. And I don't know how it has happened in your life, but I'm guessing it's happened like I described. It's just something that maybe starts off innocent enough, but gradually it leads to further and further distance or separation. You may have heard this story before, but a few years ago we had a guest bishop who came and preached at our annual conference up in Huntsville. His name is Bishop Schnese, and Bishop Schnese told the story about visiting one day with a rancher who actually had a bunch of sheep. Now, I wouldn't even know how to track down a modern-day shepherd to ask that person questions, but apparently this bishop knew of one. And so he found this sheep rancher, I guess is probably what they call themselves now instead of shepherd, but he found this guy, and he said, no, does this happen as Jesus describes? Do you actually see this literally in the flock? Do you see sheep gradually drift off? And he said, yeah, I guess I see that from time to time. And he said, so what happens? Do you just get an unruly sheep? Do one just become belligerent and say, I've had enough of the flock and take off? And he said, no. They're just eating, and little by little they nibble themselves lost. You know, they move from one piece of grass to the next, and slowly but surely they end up distanced. And we've had those experiences. You pick your head up and you look, and all of a sudden you realize that you've become separated or distanced from the rest of the community or from the flock. So the issue is, how do we get back? How do we return after we've been distanced in that way? Now, Jesus says, as the Good Shepherd, he is searching. He is wanting to bring you back. It is on him to try to bring you back in. And he realizes that that is going to happen from time to time. But if we as the church take our responsibility seriously about being the body of Christ, if we are Christ's hands and feet on earth today, then it should be up to us when we see people going and nibbling themselves lost, or slowly but surely creating a little bit of distance between the church and them, or God and them. It's up to us to then take on that role of the Good Shepherd, to reach out to them, to call that person that you haven't seen in your small group for a long time. For that person that you noticed at the beginning of the pandemic was logging in and worshiping with you online, but you haven't seen them on Facebook or on YouTube for several months. It's up to us to reach out and to contact them and to say, are you okay? To check in with them. Because you all know that have been on the receiving end of that, how meaningful that is when somebody says, I noticed that you have been absent. I noticed that you have felt mentally or emotionally distant from us. Is everything okay? Can I do anything for you? How can I be of service to you? And what a difference that makes. And I think that as we continue to grind on and on through this pandemic period, that is going to become more important, not just to people that we know on the periphery in our groups or in our church, but even our own family members or our coworkers, our next door neighbors, people that we say, I want to establish that relationship with you again. I want to connect with you, and I want to draw you back in to the flock. And we need to play that role that Christ has taught us of being shepherds to one another. And so I think that's the kind of return policy that we find in God when we have that average wear and tear, that normal conditions, that God says, I am going to be seeking you, and I will always have you back. But then there's the other kind, the kind that probably isn't covered under the warranty, the more rebellious kind. And that's the kind that we find today in the story of the prodigal son. This familiar story is one that is just beloved by so many people. It's a story that rings true to so many of us because, again, I would venture to guess that most of us have been on that end of things too, where the distance that was created between us and God was actually initiated by us and our own rebellion. And maybe it started off, again, innocently enough. But oftentimes, this one has more complicated origins. This is one where there's some hurt that's been caused, perhaps in the church or something that felt difficult for us. Maybe there was a time period that we were really struggling and we were adrift and that chasm just became wider and wider and wider. Maybe it was a time when we just felt like we wanted to venture out on our own or do things a little bit differently. Maybe it was that we grew up with what we had deemed at some point to be our parents' faith tradition, and we said, I'm not sure that's for me. And what started off as maybe a little rebellion at home turned into something that seemed like a much greater distance from God over time. But I've told many congregations this over the years, and I'll share this with you today, that as a pastor, in my experience, when I have seen people rebel and move further and further from God, it's rarely been tragic circumstances or really painful moments that were caused in their spiritual life. Instead, it was when people found their lives going so well, when they found themselves healthy, when they had all the resources that they needed, when they had a stable home life, when their career was going great. It's in those moments that people said, I'm not sure I need to attend to my faith as closely as I've needed to in the past. Everything seems to be going okay. God, I've got it from here. Let me be. And I will venture out on my own and prove that I can be self-sufficient holistically. And that's where I find that people begin this slow stage of rebellion and distancing themselves from God. So in the story today, we have the prodigal son who probably was in actually that kind of circumstance. We don't hear that he had a terrible home life. We don't hear that he was sparring with his brother, although maybe that was happening. And we don't hear that his dad really ticked him off in a major way and he said, that's it, I'm out of here. Instead, he asks for his share of the inheritance, causing great insult, obviously, to his father and to his family and to his home. But he asks for his inheritance and he's going to go off and he is going to prove to his family and to the world that he's got it. He's got it under control. He can take it from here. And so he goes out, but he's seduced by things that are offered to him, and he realizes that he's got all this money in his pocket, and so he starts to blow all of his money. And he's partying, and he's living it up, and he's having a great time, but at some point, the money runs out, famine strikes in the place where he is living, and all of a sudden, he goes from a playboy to rock bottom. And he gets to this place, and it's at this moment that he looks around and he says, what has become of me? I mean, I'm living in ruins. I'm working for a man who is a pig farmer. My religion doesn't even allow me to go near pigs. I would eat the pig's food just to stay alive. And it's getting desperate. And he's probably having this inner monologue with himself about what should I do? I mean, on the one hand, if I go home, I got to go home with my tail between my legs. I'm going to be humiliated. I'm going to say, clearly what I did was wrong. I've been a failure. I have not been able to be successful on my own. I'm an utter failure. Or do I continue on, maybe starve to death, but keep a little pride? And so I don't think that we should understate the importance of this decision that he actually has to make. Because in his circumstances, what would we do? We've got a lot of pride. And it's hard to admit that we were wrong. And it's hard to admit that we couldn't make it on our own. It's hard to admit that when we wanted to be successful and show the world that we weren't able to do that. And how will he be received? Will his father be outraged? Will he be angered? Will he say, no, you wrote me off. You took what I had to give to you. You made it clear how you felt. Those wounds don't heal easily. Go find your own way. And I suppose that, contractually, his father could have said that to him. But he goes home and he's rehearsing his lines. Father, I have sinned against you and against heaven, and I just want to come back, and I just want to be welcomed back in again, and I need to be fed, and I want to be welcomed home. And okay, so here's how I'm going to say it when I see my dad, and I'll speak first so that he might feel some compassion and pity for me. And as he gets nearer to the house, it's almost like his father has been sitting in the living room by the window watching. Because his father runs out to meet him. He embraces him, he kisses him, and this all happens before he could even get one of those rehearsed lines out of his mouth. And then he says to his servants, get a robe. No, get my best robe, put it on my son. Get my favorite ring, put it on his finger. Take the cow that we have been saving for a special occasion, slaughter it, put it on the fire. We are going to have a celebration because this son of mine who was dead is now alive. This one who is lost is now found. He has returned home, and we embrace him and we welcome him here. How beautiful of a story is that? Now, most of the time we hear this story of the prodigal son, and we immediately jump into the story of okay, so Jesus is telling this as a parable, so we're supposed to learn something from this, and so I'm supposed to learn in this story about which brother I am and what fault of mine I need to fix. Am I more like the prideful younger brother who says, I'm going to go out, I'm going to do it on my own, I'm going to live a wild life, live fast, die young, go for it? Is that my sin? Is that my folly? Or am I more like the older brother who says, no, I'm the rule follower. I've been doing everything like I'm supposed to do. Everything is just like it should be. And I find myself resentful at the people who seem to have an extension of grace that they don't deserve. Because what's in it for those of us who have tried to live on the straight and narrow our whole life? And we try to answer that question by saying, which brother am I in this story? But to do that would be to miss the point of the whole story, which is, this is a story that Jesus tells us to tell us something about God's nature. And what the point of the story is that the Father opens his arms to both of the sons. That there is no point of no return when it comes to our relationship with God. That whether the relationship and this distance that has been created has happened over the course of normal wear and tear and nibbling ourselves lost or whatever we want to call it, or whether it has been open rebellion, we have lived a maverick kind of lifestyle, we have said we can take it on our own, we can take it from here, God. Whatever it is, God says, I welcome you home. And as Jesus says, on that day there will be great rejoicing in heaven. For it is better to welcome the one who is lost, one repentant sinner who comes home, than all else. It's on us to take that step if we have been the rebellious type. To take that bold step. And yes, I think that the younger son is actually courageous for doing what he did. Because he had to set his pride aside. He had to admit his failures, his shortcomings, and the ways that he has wronged his father. And make that step toward home, uncertain of what the outcome would be. And we may be like the lost sheep, slowly but surely becoming further and further distanced. And reminded that the Good Shepherd and the community reaches out, brings us back in. I don't know which of these you resonate with, or maybe it's just that we need to spend more energy focusing on being more like the Father. how can we extend that kind of mercy? How can we extend that kind of grace to others who have failed us, who have disappointed us, who have hurt us, and that we have suffered because of? But one way or another, I know that this powerful parable speaks to you in some way. Now, the story is called the parable of the prodigal son. Prodigal is kind of a strange word, and it's almost associated with one who returns. But it's called the return of the prodigal son, and the origins of the word prodigal mean lavish, outrageous, reckless. It's because the extravagant spending of the son, and he just blew his whole inheritance in a short amount of time. But it could also be said that this story is about the prodigal father, who lavishly, who abundantly, who recklessly extends his grace and love to both of his sons. I take comfort in thinking about a prodigal God whose arms are wide open. When we come home, we are always welcomed. And where God is concerned, there is no point of no return.